Hello, and I'm delighted to be with you today for the Faith and Thought Symposium, where we're looking at the theme of the state of nature in 2020. And hasn't it been an extraordinary last few months? We've seen the rise of a virus that nobody could have predicted coming, and the impact has been stark and immediate. You only need to look outside the doors to see the clearer skies, the quieter roads, the loss of pollution, and the sounds of bird songs in places where they're often overpowered by traffic. So there clearly have been some advantages to the last few weeks, but I imagine for many of you watching and listening to the slides and listening to this presentation, it's been a bittersweet time. And certainly from myself, I know of a number of people who have lost their lives, and many others who remain in intensive care. So our thoughts today, and my thoughts today as you meet virtually this year, is to say, our prayers with you all, and prayers particularly for those in the NHS and on the front line for whom this is clearly a really challenging time. So as far as the state of nature is concerned, I want to consider four specific areas. The first is climate chaos, and interestingly it has a number of parallels with some of the themes of the COVID crisis. And then looking at BREXIT and wider politics and its impact on the planet. The third issue is internet and health. And then finally, but certainly not least importantly, the loss of biodiversity, and that's the loss of species and habitats. So let's start off with looking at the current climate crisis. We know that global wildlife is changing at the fastest pace in recorded history. New species are arriving on a monthly basis, and some of you may be familiar with a number of the new species. Take little egret, for example, a small white heron that in the UK until a number of years ago was very rare, and it's now very widespread, and it's a species that has responded to the warming shifts of global temperature, and as many species have done, has responded by moving north and south from Mediterranean zones into more temperate areas. But of course, the movements of species are not just positive. A number of species are retreating. So in the UK we see many species retreating northwards at a rate of up to 100 kilometres every couple of years to try and escape the warmer weather. So global wildlife is shifting, and sudden shocks are rapidly increasing in both their frequency and intensity. Many of you will have been aware of the severe floods earlier this year, but some will have already forgotten about them because of course we're getting severe floods far more frequently. And that is indeed impacting people's ability to remember them. So we will see more severe weather events, not just in this country, but around the world. And that'll be more extreme hurricanes, more fires, as we've seen in Australia through the course of the last winter, and far more flooding. I think the third trend is that modelling simply can't keep up with the increased levels of changes. We've been aiming for a long time as a global community at a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature and saying we need to keep within that. But it's looking increasingly unlikely that 1.5 degrees rise in temperature is at all possible. We've also been looking at trying to keep sea level rise under 1 metre, and that too is looking increasingly unlikely. But perhaps one of the biggest trends in recent years has been international hostility to international agreements, fueling the fear that we could be too late to avert a catastrophe. We think in particular of India, Australia, United States, Saudi Arabia and Brazil, to name a few, countries where there has been a significant lurch to the right, and as the right-wing governments have taken power, so the desire to protect their own over their desire to support and encourage international agreements has become quite prevalent. So this graph shows the climate trends quite graphically. It's a relatively new graph, but it'll be familiar to many of you. The line in the middle, so the invisible line in the middle, shows what the temperature should be, and the blue and the red shows temperature anomalies. The blue shows temperatures below expected, and the red above expected. And you can see that from really the 1940s onwards, and especially from the 1970s onwards, there's been a rapid global escalation in temperature. So big changes in temperature, and at the moment we are looking at potentially a 2 to maybe a 3 degrees rise in global sea surface temperature during many of our lifetimes, and that could be catastrophic. This graph looks confusing, but actually is relatively simple, and I want to draw your attention to the orange line, which is called the stabilization line. This is an interesting one because it suggests that we could stabilize global temperature in the long term at a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, and there's a 1 in 2 chance of us being able to do that. Note though it's saying stabilization at 2, not a stabilization at 1.5. And that is because if we wanted to reach 1.5 degrees, we would have to have the kind of energy efficiency we have seen over the last 3 months as a result of the corona crisis, repeated initially over a 4 to 5 year period continuously, and then reviewed thereafter. So the issue is, we are still hell-bent on growth, and the current crisis may have slowed growth down for a very short period of time, but most governments are equally intent on getting back to business as usual as fast as possible. And business as usual in climate terms means a temperature rise trajectory of at least 2 degrees. But you'll also see in purple current pledges virtually certain to exceed 2 Celsius, chances above 3. In other words, if we do nothing new, we just continue with business as usual as we are doing at the moment, then 2 degrees Celsius itself is looking unlikely. We are more likely to be on a global temperature trajectory of a 3 degrees rise in temperature. Now, the implication difference between 2 and 3 is stark. Put it quite simply, humankind may not be able to survive in its current form with anything above about a 2.5 Celsius rise in temperature. Vast areas of the planet could be uninhabitable. The implications for food loss, biodiversity loss, and many other factors will be acute. And so it is critical that we keep it under 2. But the difference between corona and the climate crisis, put very, very simply, is that people look at the corona crisis and immediately think, we're going to die. There's a risk of death. There's a risk that a large number of people in our population will cease to exist. And therefore, there's been this lockdown and a need to take dramatic action. But even when faced with a crisis of this magnitude, we hear the likes of Donald Trump saying, the price of economic success is further deaths, and it's time to reopen the American economy. And so once again, we see this strive to put finance ahead of the welfare of the world population and the wider natural world. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a number of new danger areas emerging around climate. And I'm not going to mention them all, but there's some rather long words in here, and it's good just to explain what they are. The second is pathogenic hybridization. And that is where, for example, 2 viruses that were never meant to meet and create superviruses, where pathogens, one in a Mediterranean area or in a tropical area and one in a more temperate area, find that they cross paths because of climate change and produced superpathogens. And the implications for food growing, for plants and for human health could be stark. And one of the reasons that pathogens are more likely to mix than before is because of global warming. Pathogens are able to move, in some cases wind-blown spores, and can move over considerable distances. So we are likely to see more viruses, pandemics. We're likely to see more impacts on plants and on food growing than ever before as climate change kicks in. The other one is what we've named as explosive cyclogenesis, and this is about storm systems. if any of you out there are a bit of a Met bod and like the weather, you'll be aware of the phrase weather bomb. The Daily Mail loves it. But effectively, it is where storm systems gather power far faster than ever before. And we are now seeing this right around the world, with lowering salinity in our oceans and a rising sea temperature. The net result is that weather systems crossing major sea bodies are able to contain more moisture and to pick up greater heat and intensity as they do so. And the net result is rapidly increasing, very intense and much larger storm systems. There's no necessary increase in frequency, but there is certainly evidence of an increase in ferocity, particularly in the North Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The others there, I think, speak for themselves. So let's move from climate to the BREXIT crisis and wider politics. Now, I hasten to add, I don't want to get drawn on British politics at this stage. I'm aware that all of you listening will have different views and different perspectives, and that's fine. The nature of politics is there isn't a right or wrong answer, and I know plenty of people who have a strong faith and are absolute advocates of Brexit, and those who have an equally strong faith and are not. But there are challenges to Brexit, as there are global challenges to the current political direction that we're going in. The first is upland diversification. Our upland areas are diversifying far too slowly, and our current upland systems are subsidy-led. So if you are an upland sheep farmer, over 80% of the money that you currently get, you'll be getting through government subsidy, not through production. And so there is a desperate need to find alternatives for our upland areas. And with Brexit, the subsidies are likely to dry up. Government does not have new money for farming. Now, some of the new farming subsidies are going to be very much around environmental payments, which is great news. But for many farmers on the margins, and upland sheep farming would be one of those, the future is extremely uncertain. And we need to look at and re-envisioning what the landscape of upland Britain will look like in the next 20 years, because it's going to be very different to the one that we see today. Farming as a whole is not very lucrative, and as a result, over the last 20 years, we've seen increasing areas of really high quality farmland transformed for property. So sold to major property developers, and then the farmers can take early retirement. You can understand their motivation. It's much better for them to get 2, 3, 4, 10 million for their land and allow it to be built on than keep farming and recognise that the amount of money you're going to make year on year will barely keep food on the table. So as a whole, we need to rethink about our farming systems, and this is not just in the UK, but it's in every developed nation, where the farm gate price is too low and where supermarkets are often giving back to the farmer at a very unfair price. The third is around global trade, and the multilateral deals that marked the 1980s and early 90s have been replaced by a move to far more bilateral trade agreements, where trade wars are back up on the table and where countries are fighting for resources without recourse to international bodies such as the United Nations. And nations will increasingly find themselves forced to buy particular products from the wealthier nations, for example, the United States and China. And that has huge environmental implications for us as we go forwards. And so as international agreements break down, the impacts on environment, on security and on trade are marked. And there is a question as to whether we are now entering a post-globalist era. The surge of nationalism, both on the right and on the left, could spur a big move towards isolationism, and that is something that will have a very profound effect on the ability to create environmental agreements. And then there's also the increased risk of entire population displacement as climate change kicks in, as temperatures rise, and as things begin to shift. So large population groups will be forced to move from formerly productive farmland or former cities where water supply runs short. So in all of this, we seem to continue to measure success by gross domestic product. And there are no alternatives out there that are really viable or accepted by the economic community. But we need to find them because gross domestic product is a failed measure of success. It says, for example, that if there's a hurricane and then you spend millions or billions of US dollars rebuilding a nation or a country or a region, those rebuilding costs go into gross domestic product tables as a benefit, as a positive cost element. And of course it's not, it's an environmental bad. It's the world responding to a crisis. So we need to look for new measures of environmental and economic growth. This little graph just shows the rise in Europe of the far right, and it has been a very significant rise. If you were to take a longer view of it, then pre-Second World War, there was a similar rise in parties from the far right. So this is effectively repeating something that has gone before, and it will tail off. But for now, it is a very real and present danger. And whatever your political persuasion, we are called as children of God to be globalist, to think of our neighbour, to care for the other, to focus on the unloved and the unwanted, to wash the feet of those that have dirty feet, not those that have clean, of associating with those who are different, not those who are similar. And so we need to be highly aware of the threat of the rise of nationalist politics and the implication that will have on the ability to deliver international environment programs going forwards. Here's another trend graph on Brexit and wider politics, and that's our exposure to fake news. We only have to look at the corona crisis of the last few months to realise that a large amount of the news that's pumped out by social media shouldn't be believed or should be properly researched. One of the stories that broke a few weeks ago, and I actually did a radio programme on it, was the return of the dolphins to the canals of Venice in Italy. It was a lie, it wasn't a true story, and actually the pictures of the dolphins in the video screen that the BBC were using weren't even the right species of dolphin for the region. And so we have to fact check all the way through when it comes to environment, aid, development figures. As a scientist, it's critical that what I say is as factually accurate as possible. I would be lying to you, for example, if I said, let's not worry, we're only going to be seeing a temperature rise of a little bit under 1.5 degrees Celsius. I've read the facts. And if you're listening to this as a scientist and you disagree with me, I'm very happy to have that conversation. But it is really important that we are honest with people about the truth. And honesty means not exaggerating either. I read a report that said we're looking at a 5-degree rise in temperature. We're not right now. So there's no point in saying it. So fake news, the big problem with fake news when it comes to science is that there is a temptation amongst scientists trying to get a point across, to say more than they should, or in some cases where there's vested interests with government, say less than they should. And both are fake news, both are wrong, and both should be totally discouraged. And so the new danger areas over the last few years, well, for the UK, is the complete loss of upland farming systems. As subsidies dry up and as alternatives need to be found, what's going to fill that gap? There's also a deepening disconnect in many places between the conservation and farming sectors, with the two still sniping at each other, particularly on things like grouse hunting and plans for the uplands, but also on intensive versus organic agriculture. In many cases, solutions can be found, but they will be found through dialogue, not through argument. We're losing a lot of our highly productive farmland, not just here in Britain, but across the United States and Canada, and also across much of Europe and South America. And can we genuinely build a truly food sustainable future in the UK when we are importing still so much? And much of our imports comes from unstable countries, and also countries that are being ravaged already by climate change. We need to rethink our farming systems. We need to bring back in food calendars so that we're not demanding strawberries 365 days a year, but only in the primary breeding growing seasons. And then with the loss of multilateral trade agreements, and where new trade agreements are becoming bilateral, so there's a huge risk of damage to the domestic marketplace. I'm only going to mention one for the sake of time, but the chlorinated chicken story from the United States. If we begin to import products that have a much lower environmental protection around them, we risk not only animal welfare but human health, and it's worth taking that into consideration. So let's now move on to the third of our 5 trends, and the third trend is what we classify as the internet disconnection. Let me just start by saying the internet is a really good thing. I love the internet, I use it frequently, I'm using it right now to broadcast to you. Social media has come into its own during the crisis of the last few months. So don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-technology. In fact, it is a big part of what I do in my work. And global connection to the internet is now exceeding 90% in most countries. And we see many environmental stories that are instantly relayed around the world. And in some cases, as we talked about fake news, some of that's really good and some of that is less good. 5 to 15-year-olds are spending at least 15 hours a week socially on their computers in the developed world. Over the corona crisis, I think we're going to have seen that increasing dramatically. And in 2019, only 1 in 10 children engaged weekly in nature. That's for an hour or more in the UK. That was 4 in 10 back in the 1980s. And the internet has been described as the main driver of bringing people inside. And on a sunny day like today, it's yet another sunny day out there, as you can see probably from behind you. The average age group that's out and about in our local area would be 50 plus. And yet people still enjoy nature, and the main place for engagement in nature appears to be city parks, with 879 million visits in 2016 alone, and that trend is going upwards. Next little graph is a very good illustrator of the shift in internet connection or disconnection. And the global population is in green, the internet users are in orange. And you'll see in 2020 that 5 of the 7.7 billion people on the planet are now connected permanently to the internet. By 2030, that's likely to be around 90%. So if the global population is about 8.2 billion at that point, 7+ billion people will be connected to the internet. We are rapidly becoming a globally connected society. And here's a graph that shows digital media use, and it is really fascinating, isn't it, to look at mobile use, particularly from adult users. This is in the UK. Looking at a 4% annual growth in many cases, and there you'll see a figure of 3.3 hours in the last survey for adult users of the phone during the daytime. And I guess this conversation I'm having with you, which is being relayed through a phone, through a camera, may well count as some of my time today. So some of the rapid changes, though, are concerning. The first is a rapid growth in depression amongst young people in Britain, with just under 1 million with a mental health issue recorded in 2018. And an increasing evidence of a disconnect to nature. It's actually got a term, got a medical phrase now of nature deficit disorder. This disconnection of people between nature and reality, where people are spending more and more time inside. And recent surveys in Germany showed that the medical recovery rate of young people was higher when young people could either see outside to greenery, to parks, to mountains, to lakes and so on, than looking straight out at a brick wall or having nothing to look at all. So nature deficit disorder is a real condition. Our separation from nature and our separation from God in nature is critical to human health. And we've seen that too with corona, haven't we? As people who have been able to get outside have perhaps been in a stronger mental state than those who've had to remain formally locked down inside a house, which is incredibly tough. But there's also an empty countryside. The ages of 16 to 30 are not out enjoying nature in anywhere near the numbers they used to be. Our teenagers are staying inside. And it's only the younger folk under the age of 16 who are still being dragged out by parents for their weekly walk who are encountering nature more frequently. Now, that's a very big generalisation. There are plenty of people who are enjoying nature, but it is interesting that if you were to do a graph of age profiles, you would find that it is the elderly and retired couples particularly who are enjoying nature to a much higher degree than those of working ages with the frequency that's needed. We've talked about the rise of fake news, and there it is repeated, and it is a big problem when it comes to giving out news on the environment, and it is a new trend. And a lack of creativity. I work for an environmental charity, A Rocha UK, as their head of conservation, and one of the things that I'm particularly keen on is pushing the conservation sector to become more imaginative. We tend to hide in meetings, hide in forums, hide behind newspaper headlines, hide with the familiar, and actually now is the time to take risks and do things differently. So let's use our creative juices and let's try and find solutions that will draw people back out into nature and out into the countryside in a way that hasn't happened in a generation. And we need it for medical reasons as well. We have over 4 million people in the UK who are suffering from type 2 diabetes. 1 in 5 people are considered obese. 1 in 3 are overweight. And then we have the corona crisis, which is another reason why we need to rethink our relationship with nature. If the scientists are accurate, and I believe they probably are, corona started in a wet market in a wild bat species that was being traded. And the problem with taking a wild species is they will have pathogens that are never meant to cross the human nature boundary. And yet if you handle a wild creature, and particularly if you eat it and it's not intended to be eaten, then the risks to human health are significant, as pathogens in the human body meet pathogens in a wild animal and can create something pretty horrific. Now, at the moment jury's out, some of you will be going, well, I'm not convinced that this wasn't man-made and didn't come out of a lab. Well, time will tell, but if I was waging money on it, I would say this has almost certainly had cause from a natural source. And by natural, I mean something that we have done to nature, and in doing it to nature, we have exposed ourselves to a new threat. And it won't be the last one, and it won't be the last time that happens. Richard Louv, Last Child in the Woods, says nature deficit disorder describes the human cost of alienation from nature, amongst them diminished use of senses, attention difficulties, and high rates of emotional and physical illness. Professor David Orr from Oberlin College: we have little idea of the effects of excessive materialism on children and our young people, but it's reasonable to assume it includes the loss of deeper feelings and loss of identity rooted in self, in relationship, and in place. So we move on to the next trend, and that is biodiversity loss. We're seeing major declines in species, and those declines are accelerating rather than slowing. Current recent update with 1970 as a baseline shows the data that you see in front of you, that 41% of insects, 57% of butterflies, half of our birds and 90% of our wildflowers have disappeared. Put that into context, half of our birds in terms of abundance is 40 million birds vanishing from our countryside. And that trend has continued not just in the UK, but in China, in Japan, right across Europe, right across North America, and now more worryingly, in areas where there are traditional rainforests, where species loss is huge, as big swathes of rainforests are converted for short-term farming and mining. And global declines are really significant, with an estimated extinction rate from the IUCN and the United Nations of about 200 species in every 24 hours. And that is growing, not diminishing. We are losing at least 200 species every day. Now, some news outlets put that figure much, much higher, but that's not provable. We can prove that 200 species are going, but it may be more. Either way, that would mean that the global extinction rate around the planet is running at 1,000 times higher than the expected rate from natural trends. That's the highest level of extinction in 65 million years. Not since the demise of the dinosaurs have we seen the level of extinction that we're currently seeing. And that is likely to only increase rather than diminish. And that is sobering. In our lifetimes, we will continue to see the loss of very large numbers of species. This rather sobering graph shows the decline of different species groups around the world, with a 40% extinction expected over the next 30 years of amphibians. And you can see 30% of sharks and rays expected to be extinct in our lifetimes, quarter of mammals, and 14% of birds. These are really, really high projected extinction rates of the short to medium term. So you could expect to see these figures as early as 2050. Now this graph is also unusual in that it shows that the loss of habitat and human exploitation have, during the 20th century, been the main drivers. You'll notice that climate change in blue at the right is a very small driver on this graph, and that's because it's taking a period from 1960s right the way through to the present day. But if you looked at this graph again in 10 years, the blue would be penetrating the others in a way that we're not seeing there. Climate change will become, in the next 10 years, probably the single main driver of biodiversity loss. At the moment, it's habitat loss and exploitation. They're not going to go away, but it just means that climate change will become a bigger driver still. And as climate shifting, we're seeing the rise of invasive species at an unprecedented and unparalleled rate. Many of you will be familiar with ash dieback disease. We are losing our ash trees in the UK, and that's because the pathogen that is causing it was introduced via garden centres. And garden centres introduce not only new pathogens, but they are guilty of bringing in new plants, which then find their way into the wild and then can breed and cause huge problems. Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam are good examples. But even in the bird world, some of our popular birds like ringneck parakeet are invasives, and they are now responding well to the shifts in climate. So controlling invasive species and watching their impact on native wildlife is a very, very costly exercise. And that goes from species like grey squirrel right the way through to American mink, species in the UK that have penetrated right across the country and are causing untold damage to our woodlands and also to native species like the red squirrel. And as we finish this trend section, I just want to read something from a paper that was written last year from the National Centre for Climate Restoration in Australia. It is sobering, but before we come on to the next section, which is less sobering, I wanted to finish on a note which gives you an idea of what we're up against. Most regions in the world will see a very significant drop in food production and increasing numbers of extreme weather events, including heat waves, floods and storms. Food production becomes inadequate to feed the global population and food prices go through the roof as a consequence of a fifth decline in crop yields, a decline in nutrient contents, a catastrophic decline in insect populations, desertification, monsoon failures, chronic water shortages and conditions too hot for human habitation. The lower reaches of important river deltas such as the Mekong, the Ganges and Nile are inundated, and large sectors of some of the world's most populous cities, including Chennai, Mumbai, Jakarta, Tianjin, Hong Kong, Ho Chi Minh, Shanghai, Lagos and Bangkok are abandoned. And small islands become uninhabitable, and even with just a 2 Celsius rise in temperature, more than 1 billion people may be displaced. And in high-end scenarios, the scale of destruction is beyond our capacity to model. That is the sobering future which we are facing, and the implications for us as a faith community are significant and immediate and real. And so change is outstripping our ability at the moment to mitigate. It's outstripping the ability of ecosystems to adapt. Entire system collapse and coral reefs through to rainforests are likely in our lifetimes. Extreme system level collapse will have huge impacts on food and water. And current modelling is really struggling to compute what the impacts will be on humankind. The reality is we face an extinction level event potentially before 2080 where a large population will crash. That's a sobering thought. It's still avoidable. And the main purpose of this talk is both to give a fresh understanding of the level of crisis we are facing, but now it's also to turn our attention to the fact that it really is not too late. Let me start this section now by just saying I still have hope. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you as a symposium without believing that hope is real. And I think there are 5 things that we can do. We can be a prayerful people. Prayer moves mountains. Right the way through Scripture, we see prayer as having and yielding tremendous results. My grandmother, who spent the last 2 years of her life, did little more in that time than pray. And I believe her prayers changed things. And so if we find ourselves in a place where we feel absolutely unable to do anything else, then one of the things that we can undoubtedly do collectively and individually is pray for change. Pray for governments, pray for continents, pray for climate, pray for species, and pray believing that change is indeed possible. But prayer without action is dead, and we know that. And so just sitting there and praying won't cut it. Prayer is vital. And for some of you who may find themselves in a position where that is all you can do, that may be enough for you. But for those who can, getting out there and doing things is critically important. And that means everything in your church, from growing food for the local community, through to solar panels on the roof, through to new insulation, through to electric car charging points, through to creating new wildlife ponds and putting up house martin boxes and putting up peregrine platforms, through to writing as a church to your local MP and encouraging the community to disinvest from fossil fuels, through to disinvesting yourselves from fossil fuels in the shares that you might have in companies. There are all sorts of things that we can do practically to make little and local changes, but if we all do them, then those little and local changes will really add up and make a meaningful and sizable difference. The third is petition. I guess it's a form of practical action, isn't it? But this is about writing letters to national government and demanding nationwide and global change on some of the key issues. Now is the time to be writing to our government and demanding a strong response to the next round of climate change talks, which have been put back to 2021 in Glasgow. It's absolutely critical we get a pivotal result that will change the world, not just more, excuse the pun, hot air, which has been a mark of previous conferences. Let's really, really dig deep and write meaningful and creative letters demanding change and encouraging governments to recognise the implications of what will happen, and you've just seen the data, if we don't change and don't change fast. And the fourth there is persistence. If our first letter doesn't get answered, we write another one. If that letter doesn't get answered, we take our church and we go and stand outside the Department of Trade, or we stand outside the Treasury, and we demand change. It is our democratic right to peacefully protest. I am not for violent uprisings, and I'm not for blocking emergency vehicles, and I'm not for spray painting on walls of buildings and causing anger and that sort of cost. But I am in favour, as is the Bible clearly in favour, of standing up for Christ and overturning those tables and saying this is the time to stand up and proclaim things have got to be different. So our voices need to be heard, and that means being persistent in prayer, persistent in practical action, persistent in petition, and persistent in our protests. And then perhaps most importantly of all is to remember that we need to praise. We have to continue to love and serve and worship God through this time. We see the cuckoos, we see the swifts, we see the daffodils, the tulips and the roses, we see the green grass and the blue oceans. And yes, there may be problems with them all, but let's not stop praising God for the bounty of his creation, for the food on our plates, for in many cases our relative health, for the sunshine and the blue skies. it's important not to forget that despite the damage we are causing, Christ remains the author and perfecter of our planet, broken as it is, and for him we still need to give praise. And yes, I think it is impossible. If we did all those things, it is possible for real change. Habakkuk 1:5 says, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told."